discussion, the theme of this year's conference is about e-commerce in Africa. Well, this session is about e-commerce in Africa. And we know that Nigeria has been reviewing its participation in the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So it's a very topical discussion. And I've had the opportunity to acquaint myself with my co-panelists earlier today while we were waiting for this session, and I think the SBL has chosen a very strong panel of very competent people to discuss this topic. One of the things I want to start with is the concept of e-commerce, and that is really trade that is in any step of the process enabled with technology, with online technology. But by the way, placing an order over the phone is not e-commerce, okay? It's a process where you use pure IT, like a computer, either it's a handheld mobile device or your laptop or whatever it is, and then fulfilling the transaction with payments and all that. Then we're talking about e-commerce. So that's our focal area today. And intra-African trade is very important. One of the statistics I want to quote to just set the scene for this is SWIFT, which I hope most of us know is the worldwide payments provider, says that only 12.8% of commercial payments from Africa went directly from one African country to another African country, okay? However, double that amount was ultimately destined for Africa. That is, another 12 to 13% came to Africa through other countries. And 37% of the payments in Africa, whether within Africa or outside Africa, were settled in the United States. So once again, we're in a situation where Africa is not in control of its own affairs. I was discussing with my colleagues on this panel, and I said, do we remember back in the day when if you wanted to make a phone call, your call 15 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, we started GSM in 2001. 18, 19 years ago, calls from one African country to another were ultimately routed through Europe. It was either through London or through France, okay? These are the kind of evolutions we want to make in the space of e-commerce. In 2007, I was sharing that I wanted to go to Burkina Faso, and I had to go to Paris. It's the same thing with e-commerce, and we're trying to say, what can technology do to actually bridge that? So with that, I think I will hand over to Chioma and the Extreme to tell us their experience with payments and how, sorry, not Chioma, you, sorry, yeah, and we'll take it from there.
Good afternoon, and I would first acknowledge it's a pleasure and an honor to speak to this distinguished audience. The topic that we are having to deliberate on and asking me to share perspective, I would like to give some context to it, like what I'll call a foundation. So typically today, trade is happening within the continent across borders. The difference is that a lot of it has typically been physical exchanges. Over time, with the growth in technology, with the fluidity of movement, with development that have brought about that the telephone exchange he talked about that used to go outside of the continent is not anymore. The flights that used to interconnect outside of the continent don't anymore. There's been an urge for us to keep things within the context of Africa. What has been the bane is largely the fact that there's been a disconnect between the monetary and the fiscal policies that are supposed to facilitate this growth. So as we speak to the point of e-commerce, what my expectation from a personal perspective before I go on the corporate is, we need to upscale what we have today to the level where trust of the exchange will happen across the continent without that physical exchange, which means it will further enhance development in terms of infrastructure, in terms of communication, transportation, but most importantly, the ability to move across the continent to put your businesses in place.
So what do you mean by ability to move? Is that physical movement or electronic movement?
No, beyond, okay, when we talk about movement, yeah, I know first of all you might go to the physical movement. I'm not talking about physical movement in terms of persons, but physical movement in terms of the services that you have purchased across borders. So Nigeria has a huge trade in cocoa production. You also have the same across maybe Cote d'Ivoire. But then we have our typical cassava, which people come in here to buy. They have it in other places. The question is, am I able to go on a portal, make an order, make a payment, and that good and service is delivered to me within the subcontinent? That is the movement I'm talking about.
Okay, so let me move to my... Sheyoni is from Jumia, and I'm sure that even if we have not bought, at least 80% of this audience has gone on the Jumia site to find out how much that phone they want to buy is before they go to the shop and buy it. So, Sheyoni, can I sit in the comfort of my office in Abuja and order something from Accra on Jumia? And if not, why? If not, why not?
Okay, at the moment, you can't. And
That's intra-African trade, e-commerce, right?
Yes, you can't order across borders. Or the way our platform works, you can order, of course, anywhere within Nigeria and it's delivered within Nigeria. But ordering across borders, even though we actually have different e-commerce websites in other African countries, but of course, the challenge is actually, well, there are lots of challenges, and of course, it's actually the movement of the goods across borders that creates a lot of issues and makes it not so, well, right now, I'd say it makes it not so attractive to do. Okay,
so the challenge is not technology, is that what you're saying?
No, the challenge is not technology. The challenge is actually more the logistics, of course, the regulatory environment that we have in place. And I'm talking about customs, and because, of course, you can, okay, well, when it comes to the technology, you can actually go on the website and view it from whatever country. But of course, when it comes to fulfilling, and when I mean fulfilling, actually having the goods delivered. Now, when it comes to services, it may be possible for services because you don't need to actually have any goods, physical goods. But of course, when it comes to goods being delivered, then of course, the logistics, infrastructure is not in place for that.
Okay, thank you. Rotimi, would you say that from, I mean, a legal standpoint and beyond an associated standpoint, would you say that within Africa, I think we're on safe ground if we talk about the leading e-commerce economies of Africa to be Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, and Rwanda, okay, in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure North Africa have their own economies in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. But would you say that we have, how would you assess the legal, regulatory, and policy environment with respect to what Sheyi is saying, that it does not enable cross-border trade?
Thank you very much, Gerald. Yes, in answering the question, it brings to fore a whole lot of complexities. First of all, we understand and we know that e-commerce is the future. The truth is, it's been said that by the year 2050, all commerce will be e-commerce. All commerce will be e-commerce. And so there are payment issues, there are logistic issues, but then there are policy and regulatory issues. Now, if the mode of commercial transaction changes, then the rules of the game also has to change. Now, here's the truth. We have been discussing the African Continental Free Trade Area and the agreement that's in the works. The phase 1 of the agreement is largely in place, and phase 2 is about to get started. And we understand that issues like intellectual property, investments, and the likes will be discussed. E-commerce, which is key and vital, has not been slated as one of the topics for discussion in the phase 2. And that is key because all of our regulations, our policies, to a large extent are nationalist, to a large extent are protectionist, and so in the real sense of the word does not facilitate cross-border transactions. And so the direct answer is there are regulatory and policy hurdles that has to be crossed. Now, Nigeria has an ICT policy, for instance, which came into place in the year 2012. But we cannot talk about an Africa e-commerce strategy or policy, which is key to drive an enabling environment to make the most of the opportunities of the free trade area agreement. And so I think my catch here would be, what's the answer? The answer probably lies in this room. Lawyers, practitioners who understand the intricacies of technology, the intricacies of commerce, who can advise, who can be on the team, who can sit at the table and speak to the issue of the right enabling policies that would foster and advance e-commerce across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. You're allowed to clap. Okay, so we're talking about lawyers fostering policies that will enable e-commerce. We were in the waiting room when we were listening to I think it was the main session, and one of the people who was speaking, we couldn't see his face, was talking about additional training. I think he called it practice management or something like that, okay? And I listened to him and was basically trying to talk about the new skill sets that lawyers have to acquire. Now, I was saying that one of the challenges we have with regulation in Nigeria, at least we can speak about Nigeria, is that we typically have the regulator in the mode of a policeman rather than an enabler of whatever industry that they are regulating. I'm coming back to you again. Can the same thing be said of a lawyer? How do the lawyers acquire the skill sets to be relevant to their subject areas? I'm in IT, I've been in IT for a long time. Every now and again, especially in the past, a lawyer will come up to me and say, Gerald, I need your brief. I do IT. You're used to that, aren't you? You know? I say, oh, really? Say, yes, what can you do for me? Say, no, I can't do anything. And then you ask them a few questions. I'm sorry to say so, especially in the past, it's slightly improved now. They fall flat on their face because they want to do IT because they feel that there's so much happening in IT, we should be here. How can law enable the government policymakers who are negotiating Nigeria's participation in the Continental Free Trade Agreement, or who are negotiating the Continental Free Trade Agreement with or without Nigeria, okay? How can law enable the e-commerce or enable that? Is the law current enough? Is the law expansive enough to accommodate the new dimensions of free trade and other things? Do you have the expertise?
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a fantastic question. And I may be blunt when I say that most of our laws are set up for 20th century trade and not the 21st century trade. But it speaks to the issue of legal education, like we have heard. The truth is, most lawyers are technology averse. Most lawyers would not touch the stems with a long pole. That's the sciences, technology, engineering, and maths. But I heard from the earlier session, which was great, by the way, that lawyers should be exposed to management, accounting, and the likes. I think that lawyers should also be exposed to the sciences. There is nothing wrong in having electives in computer science, in coding, in the universities. It's key, it's vital, because when you come to Gerald asking for a brief, what Gerald needs to know is that, can you speak my language? It's not enough that you know the law. You may know what the NCC Act says. You may know what the NITDA Act says. You may know what the regulations and guidelines says. But if you do not understand, at least at the basic level, the technicalities going on, I mean, can you speak to the issues that surround artificial intelligence, blockchain, cloud computing, big data? I mean, these are the things that the players in this space look out for. And perhaps if you are 60 years and above, I'm sorry, don't try. Just leave it for the younger folks. And I'm glad that the younger folks are in the room. This is a space.
You can be sued for discrimination, you know.
Well, I'm sorry, but for the younger folks, you are digital natives. These things come naturally to you. All right? And so this is a space that you can understand, you can learn. Now, you cannot wait for the system. The system always plays catch up. And that's why you need to make a commitment to lifelong learning, right? The internet is your friend, okay? Less surfing, less gaming, more studying. That's the way you get expertise in this aspect. And it's new. That's the cool thing about it. There are a lot of free courses online. You hone your skills. I bet you the players in the industry would ask you to sit at the table, because many of them need those folks who can merge law and technology to advise. So, Gerald, the truth is, lawyers need to build that skill set, okay? And once we build that skill set, we can speak your language, we can sit at the policy-making table, we can sit with the regulators. You know, so my last point is on this is, regulators would naturally fight what they do not understand, okay? And so when we speak to the issues of e-commerce, we speak to, let's use Uber as an example. Uber is disrupting the transportation space. The regulator would fight it once he or she does not understand it. Or you talk about cryptocurrencies, the blockchain. The regulator would fight it. But imagine if the regulator is a lawyer who's thoroughbred, who understands what's going on in the space. Then they are more receiving and would address the issue of consumer protection, the issue of competition, but would also ensure that regulation plays a role as an enabler as opposed to being a threat in this space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, he's at the extreme, and Edmond Olutu might start feeling a bit left out here. So, we're talking about e-commerce intra-African e-commerce. How ready is the continent from a technology point of view for that? I mean, we've talked about how we made progress with telecommunications, starting with satellite communications, then the fiber cables came in and it was easy, you know, to have direct communications. What can technology do for us in enabling intra-African e-commerce, cross-border trade? Edmond Olotu is the MD of Tech Advance. I think he has a few things to say.
Thank you very much. E-commerce is not as seamless across multiple geopolitical zones. So it's very, very easy in Lagos to deliver goods and services. Probably not the same if you're trying to deliver goods and services in Taraba State, right? So when we're looking at intra-Africa trade, we also have to look at, you know, what type of systems do we have in place? Are those systems seamless enough across multiple geographies to ensure that a trader in Nigeria can seamlessly deliver a good or service to a trader or to a buyer in Kenya? And, you know, fundamentally, we have to look at things like, you know, digitization of, you know, our identities, digitization of postcodes, seamless payment integrations, which would probably mean that several heads of central banks have to sit down together with the local switches and banks within these countries having representatives and coming together to have a cohesive plan to integrate those systems such that I can use my Diamond Bank card on a Jumia website to buy something from Rwanda, and I'd expect it to get to me because there is a distributed ledger-enabled postcode system, for example, such that the guy selling in Rwanda knows that he takes it to his, you know, postal service, and I, the receiver in Nigeria, I'm pretty much guaranteed that I would receive that, you know, that good or that service. Now, if we don't use the necessary regulation to create that confidence, then everything we're trying to do with regards the intra-Africa trade is essentially a bust from the go, right? I'm not a lawyer, neither am I a politician, but I read a little bit about the African Continental Free Trade Act. And what it didn't account for was the fact that Africa is a very, very young economy as a collective, the African countries, right? 70% of Africans are below the age of 40 years old. We have skipped, you know, several, can I call it from points, right? So we went from not having enough landlines to having, you know, mobile phones, from fixed line, from wired internet to, you know, broadband internet. And I think the next thing, if you look, and we mentioned this in our discussion, you know, just with the World Cup and the football jersey and everything, you see that globally, the world is trying to consume Africa as a product. And most of these things are not always physical. Some of them are digital. But the African Continental Free Trade area and the policies around it don't account for anything digital. You know, so how, you know, from a regulatory perspective, I think the time is now, like you mentioned, phase 2 of this discussion. You know, how do we ensure that the mainstay of the young African person, you know, is accounted for in this discussion? You know, what type of technologies are we putting in place? What type of regulations are we putting in place? And how can all this be as cohesive enough as enabling the youthful economy to prosper within this intra-Africa, you know, trade agreement?
Okay. Chama, you sound like you have something to say.
Yes, I have quite a lot to say. And permit me, I'm going to take it from responses and comments I have to things spoken earlier. The guy from Jumia talked about, you asked the question, sorry, yes. You were specific when you said today you cannot go on Jumia and make purchases on another country within the continent. But then I take it back to the context of what I mentioned to us when we're in the lounge. There's a trade today, proven, you attested to it, between Cote d'Ivoire and our own Ibadan. It's been on for years. Huge volumes are going on. What the significance of that, even if it's not e-commerce, is that there is a need and somebody is coming to make a purchase. So when we are talking about e-commerce within the African context, we should come from the context of what are we selling that somebody else needs? Which takes us to the issue of how will the purchase be made? It's about trust. So when we're talking about growing e-commerce within the continent, two things that are very key is one, you need to build trust and you need to build confidence. And what gives rise to trust and confidence in an e-commerce trade? He spoke about it, talking about the ledger, the documentation, and the means of exchange. Means of exchange today, we know we all have our currencies. But the challenge with our currencies is that we do not have a direct exchange to it. So we often go to a third party, which is the, in quote, almighty US dollars. But today we found that you can break that jinx and do a bilateral trade in the case of the RMB and the Naira. Who says we cannot do the same within the African context and have a clearinghouse where the exchanges will take note of the values for each currency? Because when I hear talk about us doing e-commerce, yes, regulation would help us, but regulation will help us when we have a structure in place. And what brings about that structure? The rudiment today of exchange exists. If you leave Nigeria and go to Ghana, you stay in a hotel, you pay for a service. If you have to do local transportation, you exchange your money at the local guy's place. It brings it back to that e-commerce trend. So I can from Nigeria go online, book a ticket, buy a local transportation means, and then board. The question is, when it comes to settlement, how does it happen? Where I used to work in the time past, a big bank that had operations across the place. Each of the countries had what they owed each other. But the biggest problem was a whole lot of them owed Nigeria so much that they could not easily convert that money across. Now, that is a rudiment challenge of trade in Africa, which if you bring it outside, this is within a bank. In the bigger sense of the general populace, what happens to build that trust? So my expectation, and that's where it goes back to the guy representing the lawyer's interest directly, we all are anyway, he says there has to be laws. But I will speak differently. It's not necessarily about the laws. It's about the principle of the fact that what the government has established should not in any way hinder the fluidity of transaction. You don't need regulation for me to want to buy from Nairobi today. It's about me saying they have something I need that I'm ordering for. What do I need? I need a Jumia to guarantee me that that which I have ordered would come to me. Then the bank, you mentioned the bank, I will repeat it, will guarantee that the money I have used for payment will get to that person. That is the context in which I expect.
Yeah, but if I ordered, what does Kenya make? If I ordered tea from Kenya,
yes,
there are 101 reasons why I will not get to my breakfast table. The quarantine guys, wherever, will hold it and tell you that you're trying to import a disease into Nigeria. Okay? The payments, yeah, if I have my MasterCard, again, MasterCard is not switched in Nigeria, it's not switched in Africa.
switch in Nigeria.
In place for that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Chama will answer that. I think he's talked about digital services, and that was part of the answer, but he'll hold his answer and I know Mr. Udotai, so I don't have to ask him of technology advisors, so yes, he has to.
Thanks a lot, Gerald, for recognizing. My name is Basil Udotai. The managing partner of Technology Advisors, and also the chairman ICT committee of the SBL. I stood outside of the fray when Rotimi and Olu were doing a great job of trying to articulate policy interventions, but it's a whole lot more than that. Given a very long history in the sector. We have both formal and informal relationships and channels with regulatory authorities. Part of the reason why you don't see extremely draconian and weird policies and regulations sometimes is because of these sort of relations we have. And Rotimi, he was a bit modest about his articulation. When an agency said they were going to regulate social media, and they were very serious about it, it took our effort, to really try to explain to them that this is really not possible. There was also a time when the so-called OTT, over-the-top technology companies, were going to be regulated and plans were put in place and things were moving. It also took our intervention. Apart from the overall policy and regulatory interventions that the chairman has talked about and others. Now, I also thought it was instructive that that comment is made in a conference organized by the SBL specifically to address the challenges around the African free trade area. And one of the things we are hoping that will happen here would be that the issue of e-commerce and how regulatory interventions can be coordinated across the continent will become a subject matter, because like Rotimi and others have noted, I looked through the schedules. I did not see a dedicated regulatory indication for e-commerce or things that would accelerate this kind of trade. Now, having said that, I heard a lot of comments around specialization, and I wanted to bring up the issue that part of the challenge we have in Nigeria is that to become a lawyer, you just go to university and study law as a first degree and go to law school, and then you come out and struggle. You decide, what do I want to do, and so on and so forth. The countries that have extremely specialized attorneys, the way they do it is, you study whatever interests you. You study history, study computer science, study whatever it is you study. And then that somehow informs your path towards specialization. The lawyers that I am struggling with to get briefs from big firms, studied pharmacy, some of them medical doctors, some computer scientists, and they are lawyers now working and struggling with me to get briefs from companies and organizations like some of you on the table. So I guess another thing that we need to emphasize as Nigerian Bar Association is to, instead of having lawyers spend too much time studying law like 5 years, people were even suggesting the law school should be 2 years. We should probably look at the option of getting lawyers to come as first degree holders, having studied something that interests them, and then using that as a path towards specialization. Finally, I want to say, Gerald, when you made the comment that lawyers did not understand ICT, you didn't conclude the story, because during that struggle, you found us, and during all the time you served at Galaxy Backbone, we were able to work with you and made your life a lot easier. Making you understand.
You have to pay for adverts.
Yes. And then also, I want to recognize that Sheyi, who is doing very well at Jumia, was one of our pioneer staff at Technology Advisors. We hired him from the UK at the time since 2008. So there's been some work going on in ICT, law and regulatory space. We just need the government and the regulators to help.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. Okay, there was one more person behind him that raised the hand. Is there?
Good afternoon.
Yeah? Okay, sorry, I'm not looking. Where? Okay, there. In front of it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah? And then after that, the gentleman standing.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Yemi Oladapo. I work as in-house counsel with Maven Records. Maven Records is an independent record label in Nigeria, and we are home to several major artists in Nigeria. My question is, how can the creative industry take advantage of e-commerce as it relates to selling of content? Primarily in Nigeria, one of the most popular, most of our popular platforms to sell music, they leverage on telecommunication companies, and there are several problems with regards to that. Number one problem is the sharing ratio. So you see the telcos taking a huge part of the revenue generated, and the little is left with the artists, record label, vast companies, and all that. However, I believe that if there are e-commerce solutions that helps these platforms work directly with the creatives, it's going to make it a lot easier for us. Because another challenge again with the telcos is that there's improper or lack of improper accountability. So you see, you get a log, for example, for your artist, and you realize that because there are middlemen between the artist and the telcos, we can't really see the logs that comes to the vast companies, that's the middlemen. So you don't know how your money, how they arrived at your revenue.
Okay.
And, that's a major problem. So we'd like to know how we can have a direct relationship with our distribution platforms through e-commerce.
Okay, that's a recurring theme in that industry. Good question. I'm sure that Edmond has something to say about disruption. Okay, so let's go back to Choma to answer the lady's question about where we'll call it digital services, really. You remember the question, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to take it in context. The purpose of this is to promote e-commerce across the continent. It's not specific to movement of goods. We only delved into movement of goods because that is a very glaring challenge to the process. But in terms of your segment or your sector, if you are in Tanzania and you want to offer service in Nigeria, the first rule, I believe, is you need to have a website where people can reach on and engage you for services. Now, the next stage is what kind of service are they asking for? So if it's a service that requires you to fly from Tanzania to Nigeria, you require the person to pay you probably an engagement fee, which was say e-commerce today, as it is, can happen. The only challenge to it is predominantly happening with the, in quote, international cards. We're asking that it can be a lot cheaper because instead of us having to do the transaction between us and settle through Bank of America or a bank in the American clearinghouse, we can have a direct exchange, which was saying regulation should allow happen. So it's not like we've left that segment out. But speaking to you in that context, the beauty is you can, as you are today, sell across within country and across the border within the continent. But what's important is, first of all, you need to standardize your offering in terms of, this is what I'm offering, this is how you engage me. Then the part of the trust and confidence is, you must work with a reputable payment organization. So it's nothing to say, I wouldn't use my name, but let's say law.com, no disrespect to lawyers. Law.com must have proven itself over time, having been regulated within a country or within a jurisdiction, so that when that payment is made and there is reason for doubt or for repudiation of some sort, you are assured that the payment you're engaging for, you can get your money back if service is not to the par expected. So there are a lot of intricacies to it, which you're saying, technology-wise, it's available and it's not limited to goods, but also to services. I hope that addresses it for you.
Okay, I'll give you just 30 seconds. I believe there's something called the ABA, the African Bar Association. Okay? The African Bar Association can become a trusted site for selling of legal services. And then you engage a payment service provider. I'm not so now, just like him, And that becomes, I've been online before in different countries where you have like a plethora of service providers, and then based, just like when you go to hotels.com or booking.com, you go back, they say, you've been here, would you like to rate your experience? And then you know who is the preferred law firm, because one of the ways you can know who the preferred law firm would be based on the ratings. So, I want to buy a plot of land in Nairobi, and I'm looking for a law firm in Nairobi to do the conveyancing for me. I go to the site and I get that. There's so many things that can be done, and that is all within the realm of e-commerce for professional services. I think that's just to do with that. Okay.
Just to add, there's actually a website called Upwork, even though that's not limited to lawyers, but that's a platform that provides, as in where you can get different services, and there are actually lawyers on the platform as well. They already have a kind of payment arrangement, kind of like an escrow arrangement where the service, of course, the customer pays for the service before the services performed and until he's satisfied their SLAs, and when all that is confirmed, then the payment is now transferred to the lawyer or to the service provider in that case. So we already have a platform. So, but I believe we can even build more platforms that are similar to that.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, the last thing, which applies across the board, one requirement, non-negotiable requirement for an e-commerce platform is dispute resolution. That's what you call the ODR. You cannot have e-commerce without dispute resolution. So, but let's go to to Edmond to answer the question about what's possible beyond the telcos for Maven Records.
I think the best person to have answered that question was Mr. Kingsley Amaku, the SSA to the Senate President, because he talked about the new e-commerce laws that were being passed through the various houses. But I'll try a little bit. First of all, the creative industry has one fundamental problem in Nigeria and possibly across Africa as well, and that is the issue of IP law. If you cannot protect your asset, it's very, very difficult to sell the same asset. So I think and the reason why most people in the creative industries use the telcos as a means of sales for their talent, which in essence is their asset, is essentially just a way of wholesaling what they have as quickly as possible before it's cannibalized by the pirates. So once the industry understands that dynamics, it's easy for them to negotiate better for themselves, and you would always get the wrong end of the stick. So I think the most fundamental thing is, how is your IP protected? And if your IP is well protected, then you'll find out that there are multiple ways of distributing or selling that said IP. But to bring it back to the topic of payments as well, that is a huge regulatory flaw that even the fintech industry has been trying to unravel for the longest time. The dynamics in payments when VAS services are distributed through the telcos. So, and that's why I mentioned Mr. Kingsley Amaku, because he talked about those laws. And what would have been good to hear from him would be how the new laws passing through the House accounts for this, huge transaction costs for digital goods and services. To know if that has been mandated and put in place, he's actually walking in, to ensure that when you do distribute your goods and services through multiple channels, you can actually get fair value for it. So that is really something that I guess the ICT advisory body, as part of the Nigerian Bar Association, could potentially put forward to both the NCC and the CBN to make sure that there's a better payment made out to the creative industry for their talents.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Chama has something to maybe concrete suggestion.
A few more context to it. And you were very particular about the parties to a contract and where there's some subversion of the full revenue to the artist. Technology has taken care of it, and those are the beauties that come with the e-commerce platforms. And I would say, the way technology has addressed it, it's to the finest detail. You find a situation where in a contract there are 10, 5, 4, irrespective of number of parties. So long as at the time of signing the contract, the percentage share of what is due to each party based on the role played is defined. Payment within the current context is able to have that put in. So if you take a 100 naira fee or a 100 naira earnings, it is distributed to each party such that you do not have to, so if the agent takes 5% of the total, that is what will be paid to him. Whereas you, who's the artist, based on your proprietary rights, will get the value of what is due to you. Also remember that within your space, there are your promoters. There is also your manager. it can go to that detail. And really, that's when we're saying e-commerce is a savior. What it has brought about is it has removed the burdens of having to go back and share what is declared, okay?
Yeah.
Or let's use in the parlance, share the loot.
Yeah.
One thing that is clear, and I also say this within the context of the Nigerian environment, there's been a major disconnect between the monetary and the fiscal policies. One thing that e-commerce is able to help us solve as a country, benefit of all is, there are obligatory taxes to transactions. You can have that imputed in so that there's no double taxation. From one fell swoop of a transaction set, the taxman is catered for, the government agency is catered for, and of course the beneficiary is catered for, which I believe the Payment Systems Bill is going to address. But the challenge I have personally with the Payment Systems Bill, even if I'm part of it to an extent, is it is nationalistic in its approach. It doesn't sell to the deregulated context of free trade across the zones. And I think that is a gap that needs to be fixed. So if you lawyers want, the first hurdle I want you to take up is go and read that document and raise objections to it. I'm not saying this because I'm not part of the process in terms of promoting national, but the level of transaction set has gone beyond nationalistic. We're not necessarily Donald Trump here. Let's open it up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question from that end. I think we'll take that and then, is anybody? Yeah, that's the gentleman.
Good afternoon. My name is Chukuma Okorafo. I'm from Sholola and Akwana. Following the conversations, I hear e-commerce, and it's really a fancy conversation to have in this room. But I have maybe a comment and an intervention in that order. I observe that e-commerce is largely hinged on, it uses a variety of technologies and all of that, which solely relies on data. And in this room today, we've been having these conversations, but I don't really hear anything so much said about our data protection laws in Nigeria. NICDA has attempted to do something that they call the guidelines, I think in 2017, but that's as far as it gets. And that brings me back to what Rotimi hinted about trust and confidence. So when you don't have data protection laws, people don't trust the system. People don't, so you can't even internalize it before you start talking about cross-border transactions. That's on one leg. And then it's also important to note that there are a lot of other factors when you're talking about data protection. So you have things like privacy, you have things like digital rights, which encompasses consent. So we have a whole lot of work to do for us to have an effective e-commerce terrain. And the intervention will be, I think there's a regulation that was signed by the AU on 9th May 2018 that talks about the AU data protection guidelines for Africa. I think Nigeria is a signatory to that, something that could also help us in putting things right. Lastly, we cannot really have an effective system without adequate regulations in this regard, and that's why I thought to bring this up. So I would recommend that we as lawyers push for policies around data protection, because that's what will instill the trust and confidence in consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Okorafo. That's actually an excellent intervention to round up. We had discussed it and we made a note of it. Europe, I think it was the 18th of June or so, the GDPR came into effect. So in rounding up, what I was going to say, and I include this, is Nigeria should take the lead, because this is within the context of the continent, right, and the free trade agreement, which is now the platform. Nigeria should take the lead, and like you said, there's certain, in every, like the EU, for example, the EU says, for you to be, just off the top of my head, for you to be a member of the EU, you should never have a budget deficit of more than 3% or something like that. And that's what all of them, and if you are like Greece went, Italy went, Spain went, certain measures kick in. there has to be eligibility criteria, right? That every sovereign state that wants to opt in will accept to meet, okay? Whether it is having an acceptable data protection law, or whether it's being subject to, as Mrs. Anama said, harmonized tariff structure, or financial cybersecurity, financial settlements, we have to draw up those criteria. And that is where I urge the SBL, and Mr. Akpata has said, in different other spheres of the economy, we have taken the lead, or we have been active participants in shaping policy. Now, Nigeria, as a country with 20% of the continental economy, cannot afford, and the leading economy in Africa, cannot afford but to take the lead in all these areas as we look to the future, okay, to drive e-commerce, because e-commerce is the reality. It's, if you don't do it, somebody else will. We cannot continue to have fragmented economies. We have to have cross-border trade. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think the ball is in the court of the SBL as the key element of, you know, the business side of the SBA. And it's done well in certain areas. This is continuous. It's a continuous engagement. It's a continuous endeavor. Okay, and it presents opportunities for everybody. So, with that, I thank Sheyi, Rotimi, Chioma, and Edmond. And I hope we have not, you know, this has been informative and educative for everybody. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much to all our panelists. It's been indeed a very interesting discussion. For me, one of the high points was when the moderator said lawyers should get 5% of that $2 trillion. So I want to know where to start queuing for that money. So thank you for all you. That was a huge high point. So thank you very much, and we thank our sponsors. We thank our sponsors for this wonderful session, Section 6B of this very wonderful conference on e-commerce. Odujirin and Adefulu and IHS Towers have been our sponsors. Please, let's give them a round of applause for this wonderful session. I trust you have all found it really stimulating. But before we wrap up, we have a few things to do. First of all, we would need to appreciate our panelists. So we'd just like to call up the chair of SBL himself. Okay, excellent. We'll call up my big brother, Ebuka Obi Uchendu, to do presentation of gifts to appreciate our panelists. Welcome, sir. A round of applause for him. We'll first of all call on the moderator. Yeah, Mr. Gerald Ilukwe. Thank you very much, sir. SBL appreciates you, sir. From the Council of the SBL, we say thank you for being our moderator here and for making this session very stimulating. Then next, we'll go to Mr. Edmond Olotu. Thank you very much, sir. Edmond Olotu, CEO, Tech Advance Limited. Thank you, sir, for the insights from the Council of the SBL. And then we'll go to Mr. Chioma Nkechika, the CEO, Coral Pay Tech Limited. Thank you very much, sir. SBL appreciates your coming on board. And then, of course, to our very own Mr. Rotimi Ogunyemi, Managing Partner, Bayo Ogunyemi and Co., and also the Vice Chair, the SBL Committee on ICT. Thank you very much. And then, of course, last but by no means the least, Mr. Sheyi Oni, the Head of Corporate Governance, Jumia. Thank you very much, sir. The Council of the Section on Business Law appreciates you for participating at this wonderful occasion. So, yes, please, before we round up, we're going to have pictures. So we'll just ask you, Mr. Ebuka, to still hold on. We're going to have pictures before we round up. Mrs. Anama, okay, excellent. So please, will you help us present that? Yes, you help us present that to Mr. Sheyi on behalf of Ms. Juliet Anama, who joined us via Skype. Big round of applause for her as well. So please note, as we round up, we're going to take pictures before we leave. And while we are doing that, I'll just run through the announcements. Lunch is served. Please ensure you look at your meal ticket, because you can only get served lunch if you go to the right room. So look at your meal tickets. The room is written there. If you need directions, please just meet up with any of the ushers and ensure they direct you to the right room. Otherwise, you will not be served lunch. So please kindly look at your meal tickets before you go. Of course, for the panelists and the members of council, the Zuma Grill would be the venue for the lunch. So let me join this picture.
Distinguished conferees, please note, all young lawyers, members of the Young Lawyers Forum, you have been directed to please go to the mezzanine for your lunch. You will be having a very important discussion with the chairman of the section on business law.
Then please also, ladies and gentlemen, remember that after lunch, we have 2 breakout sessions, wonderful sessions as well. So please ensure you are done quickly with lunch and you are back by 3 p.m. for the next round of breakout sessions. And also remember that we have the very scintillating SBL debate sessions by 5 p.m. Ensure you catch up with that as well. And then, of course,